yet another treat. Our next presenter, Regina Huerta, is the Senior Project Associate with the Policy Research Associates, Inc. But I've known Regina or Reggie, as she's known, for a few years. She actually was my counterpart in Denver and has been doing this work for a significant period of time. I'll let her share what the time frame has been. But I've come to appreciate her as a subject matter expert, not only with respect to our theme and our topic today, but one also who has rich experience in systemic work and the systemic efforts that need to be put in place to affect the change that we are collectively interested in. And so we have had the benefit of the overview this morning in the district system. I'm pleased to invite Reggie Huerta to the podium to share her experiences, both at the local level but also nationally in ways to create meaningful change. Reggie?
Thank you, Manon. I don't know if you guys really appreciate Manon, but she is the most classy leader that you can ever have anywhere, right? I know, every place I go, I'm like, oh my gosh. And not just how you look, Manon, but who you are. You are always, always kind and gracious, so thank you so much. And I so appreciate being here with all of you guys today. And do want to just kind of share some thoughts with you. As Manon said, I just retired actually from the city and county of Denver, where I was heading up the Criminal Justice Planning Council there for the last 12 years. I actually had the opportunity to create it. And then also took over the Office of Behavioral Health Strategies for Mayor Hancock for the last couple of years in addition to that. And got this interesting email that came out of Policy Research Associates, which some of you who follow SAMHSA stuff and look at things are called GAINS, right? GAANS Center. Well, that's PRA. That's really Policy Research Associates that does all the background behind that. And I got this interesting email from them that said, hey, would you be interested in coming working with us on MacArthur, Safety and Justice Challenge work across the country and helping different counties do justice system change? And so I took it. So I'm newly retired and really enjoying being across the country and looking at what different places are doing. So I want to kind of also bring some of that to you. As we, if I can work this. Okay, I'm already needing help. I get technically challenged in every place I go. I just broke the hotel's printer, I think, this morning. That's okay, right? There we go. Okay. So a couple things just to kind of ground this a bit here, and that is that our criminal justice system in mental health doesn't look the way it did even just 50 years ago. That it's vastly different than where it was. And that's good and bad, right? Because there's places that where people were in big institutionalized settings and not being treated very well. But now what we have is we have a system where everything is separated out. And people still need that kind of holistic type of care. So it used to be the care and treatment was all one place where you had treatment and you had all the different kinds of supportive services and you were able to be taken care of in a different environment than where we put people currently. And now the criminal justice system, and I would guess that what's happening here in DC is no different, that across the country, the justice system has become the default system. I know in our Denver County jail, jail capacity of 2,200 people, that at any given time, 450 people are living with, who are incarcerated there, have a serious and persistent mental illness. I would also tell you that at what time there was, so if you imagine, how many have been to Denver, Colorado? So if you've been to Denver, you know that Denver is, we call it the donut hole in the center of the donut. So there's 7 counties around Denver itself. And at one point we actually pulled together all of the county jails around us. So there was the 8 county jails that all came together, Denver of course being the largest of those. And we worked with the mental health centers and the sheriff's departments in each one of those. And it literally took us almost 6 months to define serious mental illness. because there wasn't a general just kind of understanding about what mental illness really was. There was a lot of different thoughts about that of, does it include, schizoaffective disorder? We're kind of getting that then versus schizophrenia and all that kinds of stuff. So I would just, I always laugh every time I think about it's using data, because data's sometimes really challenging when you have differing definitions of it. And that's one of the things that I've learned the most, is you have to really define the work that you're doing. Just some other kinds of stuff to think about, and there'll be a lot of different kind of national stats in here, but it always kind of blows my mind when I try to wrap my head around what we're speaking to and we're thinking about the justice system. And this is all kind of adult stuff, but over 7 million people are in corrections. It's actually like 6.9 million, but 7 million people are under some kind of supervision in the United States. We know that race and ethnic disparity is at the heart of much of that. On this slide, you can see some of the different numbers around jails, but the real staggering stuff, about 64% of those folks are suffering from a mental illness. And we start then looking at trauma, and we start looking at chronic health issues and substance abuse disorders, and we start really seeing a really different face using the criminal justice system now than what's probably intended to be. I'm not sure about what's happening here locally, but what I know across other places I'm working and also in Denver is that unfortunately a lot of the folks who end up staying, especially in the front end, more in a municipal kind of front end of the system, are often persons who are experiencing also homelessness and other kinds of challenges. We'll look a little bit more at that in a moment. So again, kind of looking at different kind of data and different kind of profiles. So we know that it's about 4% of persons that are suffering from mental illness. So whether you're looking at this room here, or you're looking at places of work or your family members, we know that it's generally about 4% of the population are suffering from mental illness. And yet in our criminal justice system, it looks very, very different. In our criminal justice system, it actually becomes about 17%. You'll see data from 17 to about 26%. And again, in Denver, we ran about 23%. Of folks with a serious mental illness in our jail. And then you look at that co-occurring, and this isn't that kind of tri-occurring where you add trauma on top of that, and you can almost assume that there's trauma that's embedded in all of this. And of course, probably most of us would argue that the justice system itself is traumatizing. So it doesn't help us all. And then we've done studies in Denver, we've looked at brain injury and people in jail around brain injury, and running about 95% of those folks with brain injury on top of that. And so you start understanding the challenges that persons face going through the system, but also how the system needs to be very, very diverse in how it provides services to those folks. So this is just another way to look at that, where we have, again, for drug testing and just really looking at the substance use disorders. And I love that we've gotten away from addiction as the terminology. We're really talking about substance use disorders now. So we're looking at altogether about 68% again with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorder. Like you, in Denver, we are facing the opioid epidemic and really doing all we can to try to address that. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things we are working on. But the East Coast here, we're really trying to learn from what's going on in the East Coast, because opioids are coming east, where we have other drugs that have come from the West. And in Denver, we always laugh that we're about 3 years, 3 to 5 years behind the West Coast, and about 5 to 7 years behind the East Coast in any of your trends. And then it hits us. So we always kind of hope that it dies out a little bit before it actually comes to our particular area. This is actually a study, not one that I did, but one that Gary Culberson shared with me about looking at persons of the physical health issues with persons with serious persistent mental illness. That's the SPMI there. And so when you just look at that, the general population being lower, and then you look at the criminal justice system and starting to blow those numbers out in infectious disease, blood disorders, skin disorders, and injuries. So our medical providers become a really critical component and area of work when we're looking at the criminal justice system. So the more that we can move towards integrated care, the better off we are. In this one, this is looking at demographic and clinical considerations around schizophrenia, antisocial personality, homelessness, and substance use disorders. And here again, you see that the criminal justice numbers just kind of are always above the numbers for any of the other populations. And then we start again looking at trauma, and one of the things that I think is no longer quite as shocking, but I think originally was a little bit surprising, is that oftentimes I think people think about women having high levels of trauma, but not necessarily males. But what we know is that in fact males have extremely high levels of trauma and almost partner with the female numbers. And this is both lifetime and current that is showing on this particular slide. The other, though, interesting thing about when we look at our system is that, so there's the mental health and substance use side of that, and that's not what all accounts for people being a part of the criminal justice system. So there's something still about the thinking, about the orientation, the problem-solving skills, the challenges that people face that are part of the criminal justice system that's still different. And so those of you who work specifically in the criminal justice system, you're probably very familiar with what's called risk needs and responsivity and the criminogenic needs. And there's the big four criminogenic needs of antisocial behavior, personality traits, cognition, and associates. So those are those things in bold up there. But those antisocial needs become really important when we start to work with our healthcare providers and our mental health providers and our substance use providers around how to help forensically treat folks. I've been in DC now since Sunday and just facilitated actually a panel on FACT. So forensic assertive community treatment. So not just ACT teams, which are for the highest level of folks coming through hospital systems, but the forensic part of that. And actually Andrew from DC, who's part of the FACT teams, was a part of that particular effort and did a great job, great presentation there with that. But what we know is that there's an increased number of folks, obviously, who are part of the criminal justice system who are living and experiencing mental health and substance use disorders. But they still also are coming to us with that criminal justice kinds of lens, that thinking and those peers, and something else is still going on. And so I would just always encourage us to try to think of how do we treat both sides. The complex needs, I just kind of love to remind myself that this person before me is incredibly complex. That oftentimes, in addition to having higher levels of serious mental illness and substance use, they're probably also likely to have housing instability and are very likely to actually be homeless. Which, in housing, I don't know about you, we have like 0% vacancy rate in Denver. We're growing at 1,000 people a month in the metro area, 1,300 people in addition to that a month. We have no housing. Even our hotels that are willing to put up persons with who are part of the justice system are now charging us anywhere from $1,200 to $1,400 a month to house somebody there. It'd be much easier to probably just get a house for them, but we don't have any houses available to do that with. So it's really a challenge to help with housing stability, and quite frankly, people don't often want to house people who have forensic kind of backgrounds. So the other part of it, of course, is the stigma. And there's a lot of stigma around behavioral health, there's stigma around substance use disorders, but there's also stigma around justice system. And so even some of our treatment providers don't actually want to provide the treatment because they're afraid of the population. So we have a lot of education to do across all the different systems to try to break all those different barriers. And then there's the physical health of the world, a part of the world, where again we have really high levels of physical impairments that people are coming to us, and some of that is as simple as, just kind of being sick a lot because they don't have the ongoing kind of health care, tuberculosis types of issues, different kinds of diseases in that particular vein, but also the number of people who are suffering from frostbite and other types of things because they don't have that stability and that place to be. So coming through the system very, very rapidly, and that kind of, one of the things I always think about is really who owns this population? Who are our customers in the criminal justice world? And who owns them? And one of the things that we worked very hard on in Denver while I was there is trying to figure that out and saying that we all own this person. This is a person that crosses over all of our different systems, and so we all have to do what we can in order to be able to try to really stabilize them. And then part of it is how do we best serve them? If we're all owning them, how do we best serve them? And can we serve them in a collaborative manner that we all then have some skin in the game and that we're sharing those resources? So truly, the criminal justice system starts picking up the pieces of this otherwise fractured system. So this is often how we look at the world of justice, right? That it's, that fable about the 5 wise men, and they come across the elephant, and they're all in a different part of the elephant. And so how they describe the elephant varies differently if you're at the tail, or if you're at the big ears, or at the trunk with the legs of the person, or at the legs that they're standing on, or the trunk of the elephant. It all looks very, very different. And what the model that I've come to know and love most is the sequential intercept model, which is really how do you start to look at folks across the justice system, and how do you look at the justice system not as silos, but how do you look at it as being kind of an integrated kind of cross system. So this is the sequential intercept model, and I kind of want to just walk through some of these different points and focus a little bit on some of the data across them, also focus on some of the assessment tools across, and some of the different kinds of things maybe to think about. How many of you are familiar with the sequential intercept model? Have ever seen this model before? I love that. That's awesome. So this comes out of PRA. We're the group that tends to do it across the country. And what I find is that it starts to organize our thoughts, and it starts to really help us look at the system not as this overwhelming system, but really being able to target different kinds of populations. And the general goals that we look at are about really keeping people out of the jail, so divert. So the first few intercepts, intercept 0, 1, and 2, are really all about how do we get people out of the system, so divert them from the system as much as we possibly can. And then it starts getting into how do we divert them through the system, how do we move them through the system with the least amount of justice system and the maximum amount of services that we can try to target to them. And then how do we get them out altogether so they're not coming back through again? So that's kind of how we think about the justice system as a whole. And part of that is always about assessing those clients' risk and needs, and not assessing for the sake of assessing, but really understanding what does that person need to have in order to be able to reduce their risk to keep coming back. So in the criminogenic world, of course, risk is the likelihood of coming back in again. Needs are those criminogenic needs, which are often the substance use, the mental health, the family relations, the job stuff. I always say people can get jobs. There actually usually are jobs. It's maintaining the job becomes the challenge. Because when you've got an attitude that says, you're not going to tell me what to do, that doesn't work too well with some bosses. So for us, it really is about understanding what assessments to use and how to use those and how to share those across the system. And it is also about trying to make sure that those are in our system, especially those who are in jail, that we're treating with dignity and we're trying to meet those needs and stabilizing them. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also, how do you link them to different kinds of services when they're out of our system? So this is just a simple way of looking at the kind of diversion logic model. I was thinking about identifying first, linking them to services, getting those services to persons in the most impactful way, and then what did we learn about that? What have we been able to increase or decrease within the justice system, but also the behavioral health system? And of course, those are two different payer sources. When you think about if the justice system does its work really well, it's going to have a positive impact on our healthcare system, because people might be using healthcare but in a more responsible way. But likewise, if our healthcare system can really, and our mental health and substance care system can really do their work well, then we shouldn't be having them coming back into the justice system. So this is always my kind of reminder slide of all these different kinds of ways of thinking about the work. And the first part of it is being very intentional, being very measured and systemic and strategic in what we're trying to accomplish. And doing both broad with kind of comprehensive but also very targeted work. And my favorite work actually is the more targeted work. So we might look at efficiencies in the system, like how many days does it actually take somebody to get through the system? So when we started our drug court, for example, we found out that it was taking 90 days from the time that a person had been arrested to the time that they got into treatment services, and almost all that time back in 2006 they spent actually in jail. Well, at that point, $59 a day, and it's gone up since then, that's pretty expensive to do that. And it also then destroys all the rest of their life, really, when you're looking at if they had been working, if they did have a place to stay, that's probably now gone. So we worked as a system and got that down to under 10 days. And so we did the same thing around our DUIs. We did the same thing around some of our other court processes. So for us, it's about really looking at some of those targeted systems through that data lens. And then really making sure our systems are aligned and collaborative from all the different kinds of angles. And then maximizing and leveraging. I think probably that one of the reputations I have is about I can find money anywhere. I'm really, really good at that. I'm really good about understanding like, oh, I don't think you're paying for this population and you're benefiting from it. So let's have a conversation about how we can help you with some of your needs and you can help us with some of our needs. And can we then kind of come together in the middle and be able to all benefit? And then really looking at diverted enforcement, all kinds of different alternatives across all the different levels of the system and those post-system supports. I'm actually not going to talk about that one. So our focused efforts, always wanting to focus on the earliest identification of folks. So, and we continue to move upstream, and I can tell you nationally right now, law enforcement agencies, anybody law enforcement in the room? Yeah, so law enforcement, raise your hands proudly, guys. Thank you. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you. Because law enforcement's really good at working with people who are doing really bad things to other people. Law enforcement's really good at that, but law enforcement's they're not great social workers. Just not. That's not how you're built. That's not how you look at the world. And yet we continue to try to push law enforcement more and more into being social workers. And across the country right now, what I'm seeing is law enforcement doing two things. One is that they're starting to have their own conversations about trauma that they're experiencing within their own ranks. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but we have got to, all of you who are doing direct service, all of you who are reading the files of folks that are doing direct service, all of you who are working in this field, we've got our own ick. That's my clinical term for trauma, right? And we're not doing enough to really help support our workforce to get that ick off. And I'm seeing law enforcement agencies across the country right now starting to really understand they've got to take care of their own. They've got to really look at that trauma and what's taking place within their own ranks. But in addition to that they are really looking at, they're understanding trauma in general, and that trauma, people respond in certain ways because our brain, right inside here, right, shuts down and it just goes onto this automatic pilot, and when there's danger that is perceived, and we don't get to tell you what danger is, that's by the individual person's threat. And when they perceive that danger, they're going to respond in a certain way, and it just might be fight or flight. And that just might, in a law enforcement term, may not be their best option, right? And so law enforcement is going to take certain kind of action on that, and can we help law enforcement do something different? So what we're seeing across the country right now is police starting to look at how can they help identify people quicker, how can they divert, how can they not take official action, how can they partner with co-responders or clinicians to help them make different kinds of decisions and get people out of the justice system. Part of the goal, of course, is also to reduce that churn, those people who are constantly coming through. If you don't have any, I can probably send you some. We have several hundred or thousand in Denver. But across the country, right, that is one of the number one populations. And one of the challenges with that particular population, it's usually not your high-level persons. It's not your felons, usually. It's usually your persons who are homeless, mental health, substance use, doing ordinance or kind of municipal offenses, and they're just coming and flipping through the system, but they use a whole lot of cost, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So it's all about collaboration. NACO, so there's so many different efforts. There's the NACO, which is the National Association of County Officials, and there's the with their Stepping Up challenge. There's the data-driven justice, which I know you guys are part of that particular group. There's MacArthur, which is where I work the most, which is the MacArthur Safety and Justice Challenge. There's just efforts that are going on across the country right now in trying to deal with this criminal justice issues. And And we need all of them, and we need all those different kinds of resources. The challenge is when counties take on multiple, there's some counties I work in, and they're working on 4 or 5 different initiatives, and their workforce then is pretty fractured because they're trying to juggle things according to all these different demands of the different funders. So that always becomes a challenge. But NACO did a really good job, I thought, when they put together these particular questions. And I think these are really kind of core questions for us to consider when we look at doing system change in general, but most certainly we're looking at behavioral health change. And that is, is our leadership committed? Do we conduct timely screening and assessments? And what do we do with that particular information? Do we have baseline data? I go to a lot of places and they don't have baseline. They have siloed data, and I know that Nancy and other folks here have worked really hard on having data. But oftentimes our data doesn't tell the story. They don't tell the story of the people. They tell the story of the transactions of that particular system, but not across the system. And so I'm always looking at, so what does the data tell you across the flow of the system? Have you conducted comprehensive processes and inventory? Have you looked at how long, again, it takes for somebody to get across your system? Have we looked at how we can be most efficient and effective with our resources? Have we prioritized policies and practices? Do we have unintended consequences because of policies that we put into place? We can talk about some of those. And how are we tracking our progress? So this is, this isn't our current model. So in Denver, when I left, we no longer actually usually show the sequential intercept model in our work this way because it's just too messy. People get overwhelmed. They look and they go, oh my gosh. And so we kind of do it in this little bit more linear kind of fashion with it. But I like this because it shows really that everything kind of crosses, that there is kind of this system that it goes through. And there's a way to really think about the system. Back home, I could have a meeting and I would have a defense attorney or a prosecutor or a judge or a probation officer, somebody say, okay, Reggie, so are we focusing on Intercept 2 here or 3? Right? And it's not so important necessarily of what intercept we're focusing in, but the fact that they know to ask. The fact that they're thinking about, okay, so our target population is here and our goals in this particular area of work then are to do whatever. So I want to kind of just walk you through some of these different thoughts and hopefully to plant for your remaining in the panel that follows me to really think about how do we look at our justice system. So now in the sequential intercept model, we've added a new sequential step, which is 0. And so that's pre-justice system. So for us in Denver, that's looking at our fire. It's looking at our fire and EMS. And we were looking at the number of calls that go to one of our homeless shelters. And the number of those calls that are for persons for non-emergency type of medical expenses, and yet they're getting called all the time to go because of we didn't have enough infrastructure in that particular shelter to be able to provide services. So it was over 6,900 calls a year to go there. So you start doing the math on that, right? And so we just added now a hospital van that sits outside of the shelter and delivers services to try to help break that down. So, and a lot of it is around substance use and addiction, substance addiction issues, and people falling down and hitting their head, or people feeling nauseated, either because of something they ate or because of how much they're ingesting. So the very first part of the model is always looking at your crisis services, your hospitals, how people are coming into the system, your fire and EMS, what are you doing with those at that very, very first level, and then your police and your 911. So are your dispatchers at your call center, are they trained in CIT, for example, crisis intervention team training? Are your law enforcement trained in CIT, which is really just, it's mental health training, and it really centers around de-escalation, but it's really about the team, about how do you utilize resources differently. So these are some of the things that we put together. Believe me, I'm not going to go through all of these. It's just to kind of have them up there. But I do want to focus on a couple of them. So one of the things that we put into place was co-responders. And we put the co-responders in. We actually started with 6 2 years ago, and the team this year will go to 24. And all 24 of those are being paid through, except for 2, by Medicaid. Now, Colorado's a Medicaid expansion state, and people look at me and they go, you got Medicaid to pay for all this? Uh-huh. And here's why, is because we can show that through our numbers that we are reducing actual costs. So it's not that people aren't still getting costs. This is a high-cost population. It's not that they don't need support. It's that we can manage that cost better if we can stabilize people more. And so that's the work that this particular group is doing. So, and when they do like a mental health hold, it actually sticks because it's clinical people that are writing up that hold instead of police officers writing it up. So when they need to be on a hold, it sticks. They're able to get to the right kinds of services. And in the very, very first year, with just the first 6, there was over 1,300 contacts, individuals that were contacted. Less than 4% of them ended up with any kind of justice call, even though police were called to all of those different scenes. So less than 4% ended up with any kind of official law enforcement action. Less than 2% of those went to jail. That's the right thing to do, right? Trying to get folks out because they should not be in the system in the first place. But instead what they got to is the right kind of treatment and services. And for a lot of those folks, it's not that they didn't have treatment and services, they weren't engaged with them. So they had an open case from mental health providers before. They just weren't going, and the mental health providers were sitting behind their desk and going, well, I haven't seen Reggie for a while. Well, can we go look for her, right? And so now we have these clinicians and the police that just bring you to me, right? It's like, yep, here's Reggie. Pick up where you left off, right? So it's about creating those linkages and again, being very, very intentional in that particular scope of work. We also did this study, so I love data. And in my unit, we had a data analysis, and we were working through our justice system, and we'd always been kind of looking at charge types. And so in one of the meetings, actually one of the prosecuting attorneys said, let's look at people. And so we asked the court system for a data dump, and the municipal court system, Osage County cases, we have 4 different judge courts in Denver. So I know you guys are a hot mess here because you have federal and all that kind of stuff. Well, we're not too far behind you in Denver, believe me. And so we asked just for a data poll of the last 5 years of data from the county court. And they sent it to us, and my analyst started looking at it, and she looked at the top 100. She said, hey, Reggie, take a look at this. And the average age was 48, male. And almost all of them, 95% of them, had listed no fixed address or shelter as their address. And almost all of them were coming in through alcohol charges. So we started, and I said, well, let's look at the top, just go to the top 500 and take a look. And we saw the exact same profile. And because it was a criminal justice list, we did surely somebody's working with this population, right? And so I started calling around and using all the different connections that we have through our justice system and started asking Medicaid and the behavioral health provider and the mental health provider and the hospital and the detox and human services and everybody to pull the data and just tell us, because again, this is a criminal justice list, so we could send it. It wasn't a criminal justice mental health list, substance use, it was just a criminal justice list, so it's public. So we sent that list out. We said, will you just please look at this and tell us how many of these folks by each top 100, each 100 cohort, did you know? And it took a while actually for our Medicaid providers to do it, because here's what they said to me, both the Medicaid and the hospital. They said, yeah, Reggie, we have them. I said, I don't think you do. Yeah, Reggie, we do. We know. Those people are coming through. We've got them. I said, no, just humor me, okay? Just run the list. And so I can have a number attached to all those people that you know you have. And only 17% in the top 500 did they actually have at the time. Even though they're flipping through the system, they didn't have them because nobody ever bothered to try to enroll them in services. Because they saw them, let's talk about stigma, right? They saw them as a problem population. They saw them as that they weren't going to be able to do anything with them, so why bother to do anything with them? So on the detox side of that, for the top 200 of those, we started slicing it different ways because people got overwhelmed with the data. In the top 200, over 5,233 visits to detox over a 2-year period of time. 98.7% of those folks left detox without any kind of follow-up care. You can bet that those types of things have now been changed, right? All of those folks, so now we have enrollment specialists for Medicaid in the jail. And we have enrollment specialists in every part of our system. If you're in a probation office, you can get enrolled in Medicaid. We have Medicaid expansion efforts and enrollment efforts going on throughout our system right now. And all of those folks that weren't enrolled before are. So what that got us to is we also able to look at cost. And that really it was amazing what money does, right? And so we started all of a sudden being able to get people's attention, all different kinds of levels, from the governor and the mayor and everybody's level, because all of a sudden we said, yeah, and you know what's interesting about this particular population that's flipping through the system? That's not just a justice system population, but it's also a behavioral health and a substance use and a primary care population. They cost you a lot of money. So you can choose to continue to pay $26,872 a year on average for this person, because that's what you've been paying for the last 5 years. Or maybe we could try to do something really different with them and we'll still pay, but maybe not at the same rate. And that's in fact what we did, and we created something called a social impact bond. So we were the first ones to do a housing first social impact bond. We just had 275 people housed in the first year with it, and we're expanding that now. The city's paying for another 150 people to be housed. Now what's magical about that is this is really the first time as government that we were really excited to be able to pay people back. Because we pay investors back for every time that we are able to stabilize folks across the system. The other thing that I've come to realize is about our system is that when everybody else was saying that we have those folks, and our homeless providers, when we did that list, and we sent it through HMIS, so the data system, and through the homeless providers, again, they said, yeah, we're working with that population, Reggie. They're the homeless, remember? We know that. It's like, just tell me how many of these people you're actually working with. And of course, what came out was that, yes, there had been some contact years ago, but not recent. Because this particular population, when you would approach them, they would go, I'm drinking right now. I can't be in a shelter and drink. So I'm going to drink. I'm going to be right here, right? And so what we also know is that the homeless providers also weren't able to really reach them. And so my message there is that sometimes it takes the push to be able to figure out what's going on. And the good thing is that list now has expanded to our top 1,400 people. And that list now is what's being used to bring people into the social impact bonds. Just a reminder again about the R&R, the risk, which is the chance of future activity, the need, and those are those things that we can target, and the responsivity, and that's how we target those. And I can tell you across the system, again, we see something that we call RED, which is racial and ethnic disparity. And there's not enough people that are matching the population, both in peers and in direct providers, and in administrators and people who are making these decisions, obviously myself included. And part of the reason I bring up the risk, and at this particular point, is because there's also a way to look at those risk and needs, and this is a very simple kind of version of that, to look at a risk need matrix. And if you can imagine looking at the high need, low risk, up to the upper corner of the high risk, low need, that's really the population to try to divert, right? For differing reasons, but those are really the opportunities to try to divert those particular folks out through different services. That low risk, low need, got to do what I call there is divert, right? That's like, don't even get them into the system. Oh my gosh, why are we criminalizing this? We've expanded pot. You guys have done something with pot too recently, right? Haven't you? Yeah. Well, Colorado, I think we kind of broke that mold, right? Us in Seattle and other folks. And no, it has not. We're not all gone to hell in a handbasket because we've done pot. But it has impacted us. It has impacted us. And in some respects, the way it's impacted us is because it's not that people are actually using more pot necessarily, but we really had to look at, if we are not doing things on alcohol, then why are we doing things on pot? Right? Why are we doing stuff on criminalizing on pot? Denver, we were very fortunate because we haven't arrested on pot under 1 ounce for the last 10 years. So that wasn't such a big deal for us. By the way, when it was medical marijuana, it was more of a challenge for us. Because from a criminal justice lens, as soon as somebody has that, it's like, oh, this is medical. It's like, ooh. Because it's almost like that get out of jail free card, because I can't touch you if it's medical, right? I've never seen so many 24-year-olds. Oh my goodness. They are going to be, when they get my age, they're going to be in serious, serious trouble, right? Because they're so hurt right now. So, I'll get out that soapbox. But what becomes really important for us is that we are now using that particular model, those kind of 4 quadrants, to sort out of our population by using an assessment tool called the RANT. And we're actually doing that assessment tool at pretrial. So we have a very strong pretrial program, and we just redid our pretrial system and have moved away, from having money bonds. So now we're really looking at risk. And we created a whole risk model around folks. And that becomes really, really important because it starts to equalize the playing field. Because what was happening before is that you would have somebody who was high risk, but they weren't getting screened because they had money, especially our drug dealers. They had money, so they could just get out, but everybody else would stay in, especially those folks who are homeless and most often coming through the system because of mental health and substance use issues. So they were staying in and they were staying along. By the way, that little data tool with our $26,000, an average of 8 arrests a year and 57 days in jail on average. And that became a really good leveraging point with us for the Sheriff's Department, because I was able to say, look, if we can create, we create a whole courts and everything around them. So if we can create things around this population and not go over that current number, but I can guarantee you that we can spend less time in jail, will you help us do some things differently as far as treatment within the jail setting? And the answer was yes, right? So again, it's always that bargaining tool. So when I again talk about finding money, it's not always I'm finding cash, but I'm leveraging all those different kinds of resources so everybody can win. So what we're doing with that RANT tool, the risk and need assessment tool, is that we're administering it through pretrial services. And then we're starting to sort that population. So we're not doing it at the police level. There are some places in the country that are trying to do it at the police level. I question that because I think police have a lot to do. And the job really is to probably get police back on the streets, right? So if you have like crisis solution centers and that kinds of stuff, they do have to stop and let people get out of the car before they drive on. But it is a way to try to expedite people coming out and getting them handed off to the right level of services, right? But at pretrial, they're already doing different kinds of assessments, and we have a validated assessment tool. And so now what we're doing is this RANT tool. And it's showing for us very strongly about how to help identify folks with very high needs, especially on opioid use disorders. And the other part of opioid use disorders, and you guys are probably experiencing this, is that they usually come with a package of high levels of property crimes. Not necessarily personal crimes, that can be a part of it, but usually it's property crimes because they're doing a lot of thefts and that kinds of stuff to get to the drugs to get to their next fix. So Intercept 2 is that next level, and that's at that initial detention and that first appearance court, and that's where we are doing, that's where our pretrial services comes into play. Again, coming out of NACO, just kind of an interesting slide when I try to think about jail and jail populations. It's interesting because in most places, prison systems are always set up by the state. And so there's always this kind of kick-down effect of trying to get people into a county jail instead of into state. And so a lot of laws get passed that bring down that level of felony. That's awesome, but that also means that counties then bear cost. And counties usually don't have the funds to bear all those kinds of costs. What's interesting for me on this one is that 40% of the jails use a risk assessment. That's not like, yay! That's like, no, only 40% of the jails are using some kind of a risk assessment. And that's risk assessment, whether that's looking at the brief jail screen, mental health screen, and looking at mental health, or it's looking at doing like the TCU and looking at substance use screens, or it's looking at any of those types of things. And one of the great things that we did in Denver is we started using the proxy. So the proxy is a tool that is just 3 questions. It's very simple, and that is current age of first arrest, and criminal history. And it gives you the scale from 2 to 8. And so the 5 to 8 population is that medium to high level. And so everybody that comes into Denver County jails, and that's the detention center, about 1,500 people, and then they get that particular tool done. And we don't have to, we have that information, so we can just calculate it. And then from there, we can sort our population. So those folks who are low risk, we need to get them, identify them, and get them out of the system. We're not quite there yet. We're not good at that yet, quite frankly. But those who are medium to high risk, we've gotten really good about saying, okay, we need to pay special attention to this particular person and try to identify their risk and needs and get them to the right kinds of services. And that particular tool then helps us be able to sort that population. By the way, we found on that we had to renorm it for females because females score a little differently. And we also had to renorm it for our municipal offenders. Because remember I said that average age was 48 for those people coming through that system? Those municipal offenders are flipping through? Well, the average age nationally for somebody to be in a jail is actually 35.7. So that 48-year-old person is a lot older than the regular persons coming through. So we had to think about how to renorm that particular scale. Let me go back here for a moment. So a couple of the things that we tried to do here, one is that the police department created a sick and injured form that is actually, it's called a 1096 now, and it is, sounds like a tax thing, right? It's not. And it is a form that talks about this person's physical kind of challenges if they went to the hospital, where a lot of the folks end up going to first get medically cleared. And then it actually from there goes from the police actually to the sheriff's department. So trying to create that continuity so people know if there's a behavioral health, so if there's been a CIT officer, if it was a mental health call, they would be able to know that now. Or if there's other kinds of physical or other kinds of things that are known about this person, it really is kind of that flag to notify that. The next Intercept, on Intercept 3, is really looking at specialty courts and looking at dispositional courts as well as what's taking place actually in the jail. So there, some of the stuff that we're doing is, probably like you, we have all kinds of different specialty courts. And I always say that, if the specialty court's so great, why aren't we just doing this way in the first place? But I always lose out on that. I also lose out when I say things like, I think that due process gets in the way of good treatment. But I also understand that people have constitutional rights to fight things. And so what I now kind of subscribe to is that we need to have really good processes in our system to make sure that treatment is available as soon as possible and all along our system, that people are getting access to the care that they need to have. So within our jail system in particular, we designed mental health units. That brought down our assaults within jail by 63% when we first put those in back in 2006. Because what we had is a very vulnerable population that was getting picked on by other folks. And so we created, they're like this totally tranquil, direct supervision kind of units within our jail, male and female. And we have clinical staff in there, the sheriff's officers are all trained, and there's ongoing treatment that's taking place right there. In addition to that, we created RISE units, which are Recovery in a Secure Environment, which are addiction units. So we have persons with serious mental health, often co-occurring, but serious substance use disorders who are in those addiction units, and it's all peer run. So there's this nice peer culture that's taking place, and then we're able to transition people from there either into transitional residential treatment beds or back into the community depending on what they need, or into other kinds of services. The other part that we've really spent a lot of time on is building a reentry program, and that reentry is going to be in two different areas because part of it's why people are in jail in Intercept 3, but also on the reentry side into the community. So we have providers, the same providers providing services inside the jail, and then being able to build this relationship so we have continuity going into the community side. Peers is a really big part of all this work. And having peers, especially forensic peers, becomes really critical to help people start to have that stabilization and to have that sense of purpose, place, and belonging, which is often lost in people who are part of the system where they're just kind of being told what to do and how to do it. One of the things that we created was an outreach court. So we had about 53% of our population that had failure to appears. And that, when you had a failure to appear, that's an automatic arrest, turns into a warrant, even though those offenses were things that they otherwise would not have been jailed for. Does that make sense? So now we have people in jail that we shouldn't have in jail. And so what we did, we looked at that data and we saw that almost all those folks were homeless. And so we created a homeless court that's actually in a shelter. So that homeless courts, we have, it's all mic'd and it's wired. We have a judge, we have prosecutors, we have everything. I run about $66,000 a year is the total money for it. We waive all fines and fees. And we've had a homeless court for a long time. In 2015, there was 131 people who came through that homeless court. And in our first 6 months in this new court, there was over 1,000 people that came through. And here's the difference, is that when the original homeless court was set up, it was set up by persons who were providing services to homeless persons that asked the justice system to do something different. And the justice system did, but not in a way that was really helpful. They put all the restraints on it that they could possibly put on, just as if they were running it. And so we didn't have people coming through. What was changed about this one is that the outreach court actually was established by the courts. And so the court owns it. And so they have a vested interest in making sure that it works. And so all of a sudden, there's a really different kind of ownership. And so the prosecutor's office, the defense, the police, and the courts are all really huge stakeholders now in this court system. So we're able to get people in, and they actually have an add-on docket. So you can simply just walk in, and they will find out all about Reggie, and they'll find out about what charges you got, and they will try to help you and get those things resolved. And instead of doing what they were doing before, which is, you have 22 hours of community service, oh please. We have a sheriff's work crew, and that might sound bad, but these sheriffs are really, really special sheriffs. And they can do community service right then and there, and they're done. Case is closed, right? And so we're able to kind of do that kinds of stuff. And I can tell you that some of the folks that have been coming through that court have also figured out that system, and so they're probably abusing it a little bit. So I'm retired, so I don't have to deal with that part of it, but I know that they will. And Intercept 4, it really is all about that reentry. So they've been in custody, we're dealing with them, we've got these specialty courts coming on, but what do we do now to help them come back into the community? Because that's the reality, is that almost everybody that's part of the system, unless they have a prison sentence that's going to stop that, are probably going to come back to us in the community. And jail is really just that point in time, and what do we do differently with them? And so part of it is making sure we have warm handoffs. We're doing a lot of work within our jail around medication. So statewide, we have created a medication formulary. So this is a formulary that is shared from our state hospital, our state prison, our community mental health centers, the FQHC, so the federally qualified health centers. We're pulling them in. We don't quite them all the way, but we're pulling them in, but also our county jails. Because what's happening, and I don't think it would be a stretch to say it probably also happens here, especially if 7 different county jails, is that all of your jails have different formularies. And if it's not on their formulary, you don't get that drug. We would never do that to you if you were getting medication for your insulin or for your heart or something else. But for some reason, when it comes to psychotropic medications, we think we can play with it. And so what we do is, historically, is that we just kind of change people's medications up and we send them out sick. Or we simply don't give them the medications. And when they leave the facility, a lot of times places are doing maybe a 3-day, maybe 3 days. So we started back in 2006 by giving a 30-day filled script. It costs us about $60,000 a year or less now. And they can get that filled script. And if they have left the jail and they didn't get it for some reason, they didn't pick it up, probation can come back in and can get it. And so we will fill it and we pay for it. But this medication formulary is really kind of interesting because what it did is it created some standards of must-haves and preferreds all across the system. So, and we created a law. We actually worked with legislative body last year, and we actually created a law that said, you need to do this. It's not an option. Now, of course, all the sheriffs and the sheriff's department supported it. The sheriff's association supported this, but they also said, we don't have the money to pay for it. And in Colorado, so Denver's population about 700,000, not a small city, but not a big city. But we have a lot of really rural areas in Denver, in the state of Colorado, that their pharmacist is the Walgreens that's 5 miles away. So they pay kind of full price for medications. And so what we did is we also said, we think we can figure out how to help you pay for it. So we worked with our state purchasing organization that happens to be a member of MCAP, So that's the Minnesota Buying Co-op. And they get a discount of drugs about 20 to 30% less than what you would pay just from regular stuff. Now here's what's interesting is that probably most of your jails, just like in Colorado, are using some kind of a jail management kind of medical kind of care system. Any of those folks in the room? Because I'm going to talk about you. So what happens is that they were all able to benefit from MCAP, but they weren't sharing those price differences and breakdowns with our jails. Well, now they have to. Because we created a way that said, no. You don't get to get your medications cheaper and then cost the jail money at the regular rate for it. So we created this whole way that you can buy into the state MCAP system and get that reduction. We created a way to say to those providers that no, you do have to let your jails know that you can get this at this lower rate. And then we also started working with the FQHCs, the federally qualified healthcare centers, which get HRSA dollars. So still Medicaid, but it's different because they get what's called 340B money, right? And those medications are about 30 to 40% less than even the MCAP level. So it starts becoming really reasonable. We start looking at those costs. So again, just kind of thinking about how do you use your system a little differently? How do we help people have that continuity of care and those linkages across their system? The other part that we did is around our veterans. So we noticed that we have a veterans service person that comes in, but nobody was telling us when they were coming in being asked, have you served in the armed services? They wouldn't tell us. So I don't know if it's stigma or whatever, but we weren't getting people to the right kinds of services. So we created this little video. And this little video is all about, it's diverse in every way, gender, race, ethnicity, age, all that kinds of stuff. And it just shows in the lobby and it shows in all the different units that just says, hey, are you a veteran? You can get these services. And so we've been able to increase people's asking now and acknowledging that they're veterans to be able to get those services because most veterans can. Not all of them, but most veterans can. The last part of the model here is Intercept 5. And that is, oops, I was behind, sorry about that. And that is at that community site. So now we're back into that community supervision. And just kind of a reminder about how many people, again, are under community kind of supervision. So 6.9, I said earlier, 7 million people are under some kind of correctional care. And you look at probation, about 55% of those folks are on probation and about another 12% are under parole. So Intercept 5 for us looks this way, and that is really to try to foster those natural supports. So one of the things we did is we, again, looking at data, we had this, if you've been in Denver, you know there's kind of the 16th Street Mall, and there's a park at the beginning part of it, which is Civic Center Park. And we started looking at drug issues and at violence and gang stuff going on in those particular issues because that was all taking place and huge, very high levels of persons who were experiencing homelessness. And they were often preyed on by all those different systems and sold to. And so we started looking at the data and we asked our probation and parole counterparts to look at how many people were under their supervision that were experiencing mental health, substance use, and homeless, and not engaged in treatment services. And of course the numbers are staggering, right, when you start looking at that. And of course that often turns into technical violations of people then coming back into the system. And so technical violations, especially for probation and parole, and especially on race and ethnicity, are huge factors that we have to keep diving into and trying to figure out how to handle that population differently and to help them have the resources to manage their population and how they look at people differently. So we looked at that, and what we found is that there was this huge number, and people were getting revoked because they were not engaging in treatment services. So there happens to be this gym that's called Phoenix, and Phoenix is a sober gym. Everybody who works there is in recovery. And they only open at noon. And so I just said, hey, so could I buy space? Could I just rent space in the morning? Just from 7 in the morning to about 11:30 in the morning, and could I have a clinician here and so a clinician from the Mental Health Center of Denver, which is our community mental health provider, and then some DU forensic students, because I always want to work on that workforce base, because there's just not enough people with mental health experience coming into the system, so wanting to build that particular effort. And could we have them work out of here? And probation and parole, could we have you come down and work out with your clients? So now we have probation and parole officers doing downward dog alongside their clients. And guess what? Clients started to come. Technical violations have been reduced for that particular population. Probation officers no longer see that person as somebody who's sick or challenging or hard to reach or resistive. They start finding that actually they might be a little bit more limber than they are. Maybe they should work out a little bit more because they can pay for those more expensive things, right? So it's really kind of changed the entire culture. And so now on that one, probation's actually paying all those costs, and the rest of it's all billed to Medicaid, and I pay nothing. So it's cost about $28,000 a year for us to run it, to rent that space, and to hire a person to do the workout. Those clinicians have the key, so they can just go in and just kind of open it up. And now some of those folks are in their own recovery and have joined that gym for free and are going on their own. And they are supported by people who are peers, who care about them. So it's those kinds of opportunities that make you feel really good, that you can help create a difference in their world. And that's really through those mental health, those natural supports. The other big effort that we've been trying to do is around mental health first aid and motivational interviewing, and just trying to really give some capacity building and basic kinds of skills and services to folks. And again, looking at the workforce. So we've had a whole effort around our workforce and really understanding trauma. And not just with fire, police, 911, EMS, all those traditional sheriffs, but also our social workers and our judges and our court clerks and all the folks who are reading all the files. So really looking at mental health and substance use and trauma-related issues, but in particular through a trauma lens for our workforce, and trying to help them get the right kinds of services and supports that they need. The other thing that our probation departments have done, we have now specialized probation and parole units that are all forensically trained. So on staff, we have diversity across all their staff, and they they're actually probably some stronger mental health clinicians sometimes than some of our mental health clinicians might be. The other thing we also did around the MAT stuff, so the medication-assisted treatment work, is that Dr. Rye, sometimes it takes just the right person to be in the right place to really be able to make the changes. So we've always had a methadone maintenance program where Denver Health would come in and dose people who are on the registry for being on methadone, and they would come in and dose them. And so we started 18 months ago, an induction program on methadone. So people in drug court who were not complying with treatment. And so they were getting revoked, going into jail, and that revocation, big help, right? And so what we started to do is saying, if you would just let us help you get some help, then we can reduce that sentence from 90 days down to probably about less than 5 days. And it actually is turning out to be about 6 days. And so we're actually inducting them while they're in jail and getting them to a level that they're safe. And then we have a paid peer and a voucher, a taxi voucher. It's not Uber, it's taxi. And they actually come and meet them at the jail and take them right to their treatment. And so there's just this great warm handoff that takes place. In addition to that, if you've ever been around somebody who's withdrawing from opioids, it's really ugly. It's really painful for folks. And oftentimes what people do is there's some jails I've been working with recently that are using Tylenol to do that. I'm like, oh my gosh. Other places doing clonidine, probably not a whole lot better. And so we've actually started to use Suboxone to help do the withdrawal and start weaning people off, which is much more humane. It's been amazing what people are telling us about that experience. And then we're able to also do Suboxone induction in the jail. And then everybody who leaves the jail is leaving with resources and also with naloxone and training around that naloxone about how to use that. And we've been training, we've created a policy for the city around training folks for naloxone. So our police department and fire carry naloxone, but now so do probation and other folks, all carrying naloxone. Our social workers, everybody has it available to them. Some of our lessons learned, again, is really breaking down the system and using the SIM language, updating it. We visit the SIM every single year. We also did all the same work for the juvenile system. So I'm just focusing on the adult system here, but doing it also for the whole juvenile system. Money really was the thing that got attention. So I always say to people, don't just look at your data, look at your cost. So I can tell you it's $694 to execute a warrant in Denver, Colorado. So when I look at all those that outreach homeless court, or the outreach court, and every time we've been able to avoid, because all those people, otherwise they can come in, they've got a warrant, and they can just vacate that warrant, we're saving hundreds of thousands of dollars because we're able to do that. And I can demonstrate that we actually are saving those particular dollars. Because otherwise, I guarantee you, they would be arrested, and they'd be in jail. So we look at costs on everything. Data really speaks. So all of you who do data work in here, you are so appreciated. And your work is really critical. And we need you to push things forward. We need you to get creative and out of your silos and say, what if I link this data to this data? What would that look like? Because it wasn't until we looked at, not just from a criminal justice perspective, but we looked across all those different systems that we were able to say, this is actually what this person is costing you. And more than that, is we're able to create the buy-in, because it wasn't that should the hospitals benefit, should the ED rooms benefit, should the substance use providers benefit, should the justice system benefit. No, we should all benefit, but most of all, the persons that we're trying to serve should benefit. And it only happens that way when people start to share that information and come together in a system. I always think about creating a new box, because that's what we're doing, right? All the work that I've done, all the work that Nancy's done here, and Manon and all of you are doing here, you're just creating new boxes, and someday somebody's going to come along and change those boxes, and how wonderful that is. But we need to keep changing those new boxes, and we need to do it sometimes with different partners. Oftentimes we stay within our own silos, and there's a lot of other people who are willing to help, and how do we really maximize and leverage their help? And the last thing that I would give you is that something that I've learned is always in play, and that is the MET. That is money, ego, and turf. So the MET's always in play. It doesn't go away. And I think that those who have learned to manage the MET have learned to appreciate the MET and just play the MET. We do really well. And I know that under the leadership of Manon, you guys are able to do that. Because the MET is always about how do we help you win? Because then we all can. So those are my comments today. Thank you for the opportunity. Any questions? Nope. Okay. Well, again, thank you so much. Was there a question? Nope.
Okay, so when you build Medicaid for the yoga instruction, was that you build them because you had clinicians there with them, or how does that work exactly?
Yeah, about billing Medicaid, right? For the co-responders?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the co-responders on billing Medicaid, and we bill Medicaid for everything. For everything.
That's what we have to figure out, I think, here, how to do that.
So on the Medicaid, what we did on the co-responders is we were able to demonstrate. So we looked at, my agency put up the money for the first 6, actually the first 4. The MHCD, the Mental Health Center, had 2 that they brought to us from another grant that they could redo. And we were able then to track those costs. So we do something called Power BI, which is just a really simple Excel database that comes out. It's really fun to play with. So it's a way to kind of look at dashboards. And we were able to really look at what the cost utilization is and the benefit could be. And then we started working directly with Medicaid to say, we need you to pay up front so that we can build this team out. Because otherwise, it's like every 6 months, you're trying to negotiate with them. And so we met with Medicaid, and it took us probably about 8 months But it was our BHO and the Mental Health Center of Denver, who are our partners, to go to Medicaid to say, we need to get this money up front. We also were able to do that actually for our solution centers. We're bringing on a crisis solution center and got Medicaid to put up front $4 million for those operations. Again, because we've done a really, really good due diligence in looking at data and trying to come up with that supportive data. So the Medicaid part, the clinicians are out of the Mental Health Center of Denver. So they're all licensed LPCs, LCE, SWs, and all their services are billed. By the way, of course, when people go into jail, so if I've got a clinical staff and they're going to jail or they're waiting in court, they can't bill that time, right? So you have downtime there. So then the rest of that is, my argument and support to the Mental Health Center is that I can make you whole. So I had some other dollars that I could utilize to help pay those particular costs so that they weren't out dollars, or probation or other parts of the system through offender service fees was able to cover some of those costs. So we're always looking at how do we share some of those resources and make people whole.
Thank you for your brilliant.
I've never been brilliant. I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like in the zone with these details and data. And I wanted to return to something you were speaking about early, about addressing trauma and conditioning within our own ranks and within agencies, the IC that you spoke of. What did that look like in law enforcement agencies in Denver?
So a couple different things. One is, and I didn't put in the slides and should have, but Fred Osher had created a matrix a few years ago. Fred's a researcher and works around criminal justice, and he had created a matrix that really looks at different kinds of tiers around risk and needs. And so I took that and created one for trauma. So, and I can send it to Manon. Actually, I was just with Fred earlier this week and saying, hey, by the way, took your information. But we started looking at, in the Department of Safety is where it started coming out of. We started looking at through risk management. So through the city risk management, looking at the level when police are likely to start pulling a gun. 6 years. 6 years on the force, start being more likely to pull a gun. So we started looking at, and then we started looking at divorce and alcoholism and those kind of rates. And we were able to make the data work in saying, here's our factors. So Department of Safety actually hired a risk manager to help then work around peer services for police, sheriff, and fire. We just recently created a video, actually, around police, sheriff, fire, and social workers coming together in EMS, talking about peer services. That now goes out to all their members. It's just like we have like little 2 and 4 minute kind of clips that can go out for folks, so people might think about, oh, maybe I should talk to a peer, one of my peer supports, about what's going on, and really started intentionally creating a different way for people to start looking at themselves. But it really started by us looking at the data through a risk lens and the cost that was taking place in the system. And again, part of what we probably have not, since I've left the city, I'm not sure where they are with it now, but is really looking at those people who are reading the files, right? All the people who are typing up and not directly working on the streets, but they sure are impacted, right? And how do we also help them? So that part is not done yet, but the peer part, the peer services is very much done. The videos are done. And so now for the city's work, it's really getting down to those other folks. The other thing we did is, in my office, I hired a person that all he does is trainings around trauma and mental health first aid. They're free trainings all across the city to community groups and all the different agencies. And we've particularly have worked, I was an appointee for the mayor, so we worked with all the different city agencies and trained staff from every one of those agencies around trauma and mental health first aid. And that really went a long way to start kind of laying that riverbed, if you will, for the discussions to follow. And then we created, in addition to the co-responders who are working outside with the police, and we're actually adding 2 of the co-responders are coming on are working with fire, and 2 others of those co-responders are working in the school district. And the reason that so the school district has clinical staff, But the challenge is that the school district clinical staff go to the borders of their school. And so we're hiring juvenile and child and juvenile experts that are mental health from the mental health center to be able to go into the school so they can continue the services into the community with families. So again, trying to look at that a little bit differently and how do you leverage that particular work. So the trainings have really kind of lit things on fire. So now we have all these people trained around trauma and mental health. And then we also, through Human Services, actually created a mental health team. So those mental health folks there actually work, I don't know about your Human Services departments, but it's hard. When people are coming in and they're frustrated and they don't understand the system and they're trying to walk through and they're trying to keep their job and trying to keep their family together, and there's all these people that are trying to run their lives at the same time in their opinion and all that type of stuff. And so these mental health clinicians work directly there on site. With people, the persons are coming in for services, but also with staff, to help staff, because sometimes, especially social workers, they're going out and they're seeing horrible things, right? And we weren't doing anything to help even recognize or debrief that. It's like next case. It's like, oh my gosh, right? So wanted to start providing services to them, and so have just been really infecting it. And the other thing we did is we started working, we have Dr. Phil Tedeschi at the University of Denver, and he runs an animal-assisted intervention program. And so we started this whole pilot where we have mental health clinicians who are all trained with animals, with dogs in particular, and they are now going and doing outreach for us. And in particular, doing outreach for us around homeless. Because sometimes the dogs can interact before humans can. And so it's just, it's great. And then if you come to Denver Airport, you'll probably also see some dogs that are in there. There's drug dogs, yes, but not these. These are other kinds of dogs that are not therapy dogs per se, but we're just using them just to kind of help people have something to hug on a little bit while their flight's delayed. So using animal-assisted treatment and those kinds of opportunities. And I know my time has expired. And you guys have to thank Khalil for all the work and also putting this stuff together.
Thank you so much, Reggie. Do we have some takeaways from the session that we just participated in? Some takeaways? We're going to have a quiz at the end. Just letting you know. I am pleased. This is going to roll right into, you had a long lunch. We're going to roll right into our last session of the day. So I invite our last panel to actually come to the dais because we have so many. We want you to sit up here and have room. So I invite all of the panelists to come forward, please.